Hello and welcome to this Bloomberg Equality Summit panel on the effect of the pandemic on women in the workforce. I'm Lizzie Burden, UK economy reporter here at Bloomberg, and I'm delighted to say that we've got two very distinguished speakers with us today. First, Dr. Karen Kimbrough, chief economist at LinkedIn and formerly of Google, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley and the Federal Reserve. We're also joined by Christopher Rauh, assistant professor at the University of Cambridge, which, as an alumna myself, I would say is the world's finest academic institution. Chris's work on the impact of the pandemic on women's work has stimulated various conversations with UK ministers, so I'm sure this will be a fascinating discussion. Thank you both so much for taking the time to join us. Karen, I want to start with you. Earlier this year, the World Economic Forum published research showing that the pandemic had set back equal gender pay a generation. Now that we're hopefully in the recovery phase of the pandemic, is it still the case that women's work has suffered more than men's?
So, yeah, first of all, thanks for having me here. We definitely saw that women were most impacted during COVID. And a lot of those factors had to do with where they worked, the type of work they had, and the disproportionate burdens of childcare. But I would say that we're seeing a lot of resilience now, and in our own data, hiring rates for women are actually exceeding those of men. So we're seeing a lot of resiliency and sort of a comeback story for women, if you will. But it was a pretty dark moment last year.
And Chris, we know that women were far more likely to take on childcare and homeschooling duties than men during the pandemic. And almost as a silver lining, if you can call it that, the reality of juggling work and childcare was really exposed. Have governments and companies around the world done enough to expand childcare provision to support working parents, especially working mothers?
No, so I would say a dire situation got worse during the pandemic. It's very expensive in the US and the UK. In the UK, there are long waiting lists to receive childcare. During the pandemic, access became even more unequal, so non-white families were more likely to be exposed to childcare closures in the US. Private schools were more likely to be engaged in online learning. And I think the policy that summarized this all is that the pubs opened before the schools. So I think we're still a long way from improvements, and research shows that we need childcare in order to create labor market opportunities, in particular for mothers. And we also need good childcare because poor childcare is linked to worse child development. So we have to think about unleashing the potential of the current workforce, but also to create the skills of the future workforce.
And Karen, even in countries where governments and companies are generous with childcare provision, is this gendered division of labour ultimately a cultural problem that starts at home? Can we break that cycle?
It's interesting you should say that. I mean, one of the things that we observed in our data, which spans the globe at LinkedIn, is that women were disproportionately affected in every single country. There was no country where women fared better than men during the pandemic. So it clearly is something that goes beyond any particular culture or society and is sort of endemic. I think the one thing we can do is have hope that there's generational changes that start to take place. And the more that men, for example, take paternity leave, and that's available to them, the more let's call it the burdens or the opportunities of childcare can be shared between women and men. One of the other things I would also say is that companies need to kind of continue to provide more and more flexibility for workers so that they can, be met where they are, depending whether they have very needy young children or, older children are more independent. Workers need different kinds of flexibility in their schedule. And I think women in particular have always sought out work that provided more, say, schedule flexibility because they needed that for juggling all the other burdens at home.
Picking up on that point, Chris, for so long we've been told that flexible working was meant to be good for women, but if women already tend to earn less than men, in the hybrid model of working where people work at home some of the time and work at the office some of the time, will we tend to see men returning to the office and women working at home while juggling childcare?
That could be the case, and research shows that if you're working from home, you're more likely to be overlooked when the next promotion comes about. So about half it reduces the likelihood of you being promoted by about half in one study. And also, we have to worry about flexibility. There are two types of it. There's the good type where the employee decides when to work the extra hours, but there's also the bad flexibility if the employer sets the extra hours and changes them frequently. And it's actually women who are more likely to be on 0-hour contracts, which are the extreme form, do not provide income security and also no career progression. So if we have women working at home on these type of contracts, then we're not going to see career progression.
If you're watching, don't forget to leave us a question to ask Karen and Chris. We'll try to get to it at the Q&A section later on. Karen, I want to talk about a later stage in women's life, menopause. Menopausal women have talked to me about having to wear ill-fitting PPE to work that's designed for men. It's made their hot flushes worse. And we know that older workers have tended to be the last left on government employment support, and it's harder for them to retrain. What data from LinkedIn do you have to understand the impact of the pandemic on older working women?
Yeah, so what we're seeing at LinkedIn in our data is that older women are definitely taking a little bit longer time to rejoin the workforce. So for example, as we start to see this recovery play out, the first ones to kind of come back into the workforce are younger workers or those who are sort of mid-career but highly skilled, and older workers seem to be lagging. I think it's, a lot of this has to do with, one, in some cases, there are older generations that actually didn't fare so poorly during the pandemic. They may have had more exposure to the stock market and retirement funds, at one end of the income spectrum. And at another end of the income spectrum, they may have felt hesitation about rejoining the workforce because of health and safety concerns. So for a variety of reasons, older workers and older women in particular haven't come back as quickly into the workforce, which I think is really a shame. That's not what we want. And so we'd like to see a multi-generational workforce. So I think there's still a lot of work to do.
And Chris, not all symptoms of menopause are physical. Your research shows that not just for older women, but women generally, their mental health was significantly impacted by the lockdowns, and more so than men. How much of that is because of the impact on their work-life balance? I mean, we've heard so much about people feeling like working from home has been more like living at work.
Yeah, so part of it is driven by working parents. There's a study about that in the UK, finding that in particular working mothers, they had to juggle more tasks and suffered worse mental health. But we also have some research in the US where, irrespective of the work situation, we find that the lockdowns worsened mental health more for women than for men. And part of it can be explained by fears of troubles about paying bills and more childcare, but there's an additional element, which one seems to be able to link to the cut ties of social networks. So it's not only the labor markets, it's also the social networks that suffered under the lockdowns and the physical distancing measures.
And Karen, are there any positives to have come out of this crisis for women at work? Are there any long-term structural changes that could be for the better?
Well, if I put my kind of optimistic lens hat on, I would say I do think now there's a wider realization that people can work productively in a remote setting. Although I would agree with Chris in saying that, yes, past evidence shows that when you're not in the room, you're more likely to be overlooked. I mean, that seems perfectly reasonable. But I think, optimistically speaking, companies are now much more aware of kind of, let's say, in the white collar space, of flexibility that they can provide. And I think also that there's a moment going on right now where laborers, workers are beginning to flip the script a little bit. They're beginning to demand more accommodations. And and employers are offering them. So it may not just be flexibility of schedule, but it could also be, I want to work remote, I want to work hybrid, I don't want to work on Tuesdays, or I want more pay. All of those things seem to be in the equation, and they're all at the moment currently in favor of the worker.
And Chris, can you give us more detail on that? How can employers tailor the hybrid working model so that even if people aren't in the office, they're still very much a part of the decision-making process?
So one idea is to have kind of a rotation with core times when people coincide. You don't want to have only the employees choosing the 2 days they work from home, because then it tends to be Monday and Friday, and then you have overcrowding in the office Tuesday till Thursday. If you want to also reduce office space, for instance. So, and another issue is, especially for young workers, they want to learn from their seniors. They want to form these relationships, and for them, it's very important to also get FaceTime. So you can't really replicate that completely over Zoom. So the idea is to have some kind of rotation with core overlaps between people.
Karen, what will the workforce look like a year from now, especially in terms of pay?
Yeah, sure. So if the current trends continue, then we expect to see wages still running a little bit above their, say, longer term average. And I'm talking about the whole cohort. And by the way, there's many ways to look at wage data. If you look at it in terms of just nominal increases, so just dollars that you receive, not accounting for inflation, we're expecting that to continue to increase. But if you're thinking about real wages, which are actually those adjusted for what's going on with inflation, because inflation is running a little bit higher, that wage growth won't seem as positive. However, we're still expecting positive wage growth overall. And I think the bigger question is just who's benefiting the most from the wage growth, because what we've seen in the past is that the least well paid have seen the slowest wage growth historically.
Chris, what do you see as the future for wage growth for women?
I see some positive trends which will receive a dent from the pandemic, because spending time out of work, you don't learn on the job, you miss out on that promotion, so that's going to put a dent in it. But women are in many of the fastest growing occupations, for instance, in social care. They're much more likely to go to university by now than men in most countries, and also the share studying science and mathematical degrees has been increasing. So I think there will be some wage growth driven through these aspects.
Karen, let me put a question to you from the audience. It says, what are your thoughts about companies collecting caregiver status data on employees and then reviewing pay and promotion data based on status?
Well, it seems to me that we ought to be taking into account that everybody is going to need some accommodations for what's going on in their life. So if you were only collecting care status data, you would be missing out on other ways in which perhaps, let's say, men have other obligations that aren't being captured. So I say that because I don't want to then stigmatize women as, oh, well, they have a lot of care obligations and therefore, we need to make these accommodations, and they start to be seen as though they're being coddled in the workforce. That's absolutely not the case. So I don't know if I actually think it's a great idea to only collect one aspect of data. I think we need to kind of think about caregiving as an obligation for, parents, regardless of their gender, and just assume that everybody is going to have caregiving obligations. I think if companies make it available to people, they will avail themselves of it. That's what we see in younger generations. When you offer them paternity leave, they take it. And so therefore, that's more of a balance between men and women. And I think that's where we want to get to.
I think so often when we're talking about women's work and work generally, we forget the importance of unpaid work, caregiving. Chris, can I put the same question to you? What are your thoughts about companies collecting caregiver status on employees and then reviewing pay and promotion data based on status?
So it's a tricky question, because when you're talking about hiring, then this data could also be used in bad ways. So I think there it's important for the government to level the playing field, to have the right policies in place that create rules for not only maternal but also paternal leave. And then if an employer is collecting this data, they're much less likely to want to use it to discriminate. And then, because it can be useful information, you can help people. You could offer them different type of contracts, but if you're not allowed to collect that data, then obviously you can't do that. So it's a tricky one.
Really tricky with the whole privacy question. Karen, another question from the audience. Are there any excellent examples of companies that are doing very progressive initiatives to make workplaces more equal?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. What we're seeing is, I'll tell you right now, at LinkedIn, we're all as a company being given Friday off for just a well-being day, because LinkedIn has recognized that people can get burnt out. And so everybody's getting a day off, so to speak. And I think a lot of companies are experimenting with ways to kind of provide a little bit more space for people to balance home life with work life. And so there are many, many examples of this, but I just wanted to call out LinkedIn for one, since I'm living it and we get this day off on Friday. But I think other ways that companies are starting to, experiment is to do something that Christopher was talking about, which is maybe job sharing, for example, where people may share a job and they have a little bit more control over their own schedule. So as opposed to you just being told what shift you have and it changes week to week, but you may know that you actually have a partner with a role, and therefore you can sort of be clear about what time you allocate to work, what time you allocate to home, and at the same time you're sharing with one partner. Sort of this job share approach, I think, has been really, really successful, especially for women.
And on that positive note, in our last couple of minutes, Chris, I want to ask you, what's one tool, tip or resource that you'd recommend to women who are watching who might have struggled at work through the pandemic?
It relates to what Karen just said. So there's a new book by Claudia Goldin about the career and the family. And one of the main ideas is that we have these high-paying jobs that require ultra flexibility, and that this is where a lot of the gender gap is being created. But that we should think of ways of making these jobs, because maybe also the men don't want to work 70 hours a week and not see their children. So by making these jobs more flexible in a humane way, we could achieve more gender equality. And I think that book is a good, because it also gives the overview of the whole history.
Awesome. Let's definitely hear it for the dads too. Karen, is there a tool, a tip or a resource that you'd recommend?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that I'd recommend. One is we're seeing a lot of women actually strike it out on their own, sort of as founders and entrepreneurs. Women are kind of looking to kind of chart their own course. We saw a 27% increase in women-founded companies during the pandemic. And so I think, one way is for women to kind of also explore courageously going at, charting their own course. We actually have something called a service marketplace where you can go on and kind of find, do your freelance job and find possible connections for your business that'll make it easy for you to work. And so I think there's ways to kind of, for women to sort of think broadly. If your needs aren't being met in your current role, try something that you've always wanted to do that's different.